The property market is not about to crash, but now is the time to start planning for when that will happen. It's several years away, and in this video I'm going to cover 10 points that you should consider so that you are ready to take advantage of what will be a greater opportunity than the present climate of rising prices. For the first thing that we need to do is to understand when the next crash is likely to happen, and that goes in an 18-year cycle. Now, I've actually done another video on this, and I'll put a link in the description so that you can access that video, because I'm just going to give you a very brief explanation of that here. But essentially what we have is that we have two periods of 7 years where the market is up, and then we have a 4-year period where there's a contraction, and currently we are in the second half. In other words, that second period of 7 years. So if we look at the previous drop in the market, and let's just take it from the bottom of the market, and this would be coming out of that bottom of the market when we start to have an uptick. Then we've got this 7-year period. This was about 2019-20 that we reached the mid-cycle. And then we have a slight mid-cycle correction. There's all sorts of reasons it seems to be triggered, and that's what the media picks up on. But this is essentially what happens, is that we have this mid-market correction. I remember speaking to people in 2016, and I could see that the mid-market correction was going to come about the time that we exited out of the EU, and so a lot of people I knew were going to blame the EU for that. And then of course we had the pandemic, which was an upset in the market, and so we've come out of this and we've started to see this uptick, and we're going to see this uptick till about 2026, and at 2026 or thereabouts, it's not an exact science and nobody can predict it exactly. It may actually carry on a little bit longer, just depending, because we've got unusual circumstances. But it's certainly around 2024 to 2026 is when you want to be thinking a bit more cautiously, and we'll cover that in some more points in this video. And then you're going to see a drop in the market, and that drop is going to last about 4 years. And then we're going to see some market recovery. And part of that drop is really about the banks. They'll have overextended. They will need to repair their balance sheets, and that's pretty much how long it takes them to really get that process under wraps. And in fact, what will happen is that they'll still be cautious then after that period of time, because they will be remembering this period where they were exuberant with their lending, and therefore they got caught out, and therefore they now need to be a bit more cautious. Generally, you'll start to see this uptick in London. You won't see it much else in the country. In fact, you'll hear about the market, how it's really progressing, because the media is London centric, and so you'll hear about how prices are rising and how things have started to recover, and you'll be looking around if you're not in London thinking, well, where is this recovery? And particularly the further you get out from London, the more that it's going to longer it's going to take for you to get the uptick. And typically in Scotland and the north of England, in parts of Wales, you're not really going to see any of this real uptick until the second part of the cycle, and that's probably what your experience has. So during the first one, there was no real uptick in those areas, but in the second one they start to do better, and the London has sort of then started to run out a bit of steam, and they don't see the increases, and then of course we come to the crash. The other thing is that the crash usually starts again in London and starts to then filter out through the rest of the country, particularly in Scotland, where I'm based. You usually find that it's about 6 months behind. But the important thing is to understand that it is coming, but it's got some time to go, and you've got time to prepare for it. So during this period, you may find that interest rates rise. That will be dependent on the state of the economy, but part of the reason for that is that they will start to see the economy really overheating. They'll be concerned about that. They want to extract some money from the economy, and one of the ways that the Bank of England will do that will be to cause an interest rate rise, which will then be passed on by mortgages. Of course, if you've got fixed term mortgages, then that will certainly help you ride out that particular period, but fixed rate mortgages still come to an end at some point. While we may have gone through a period of high house price inflation, the general economy may be inflationary too. And in fact, there's a lot of inflationary pressures currently in the economy. The real issue there is whether that's going to be sustained or whether that's going to contract. One of the real issues with inflation is that inflation is okay as long as wages continue to rise. But if wages continue to rise and there's no corresponding increase in the productivity, then that leads to a thing called stagflation. So in fact, what happens is that you just have a spiral of increasing prices, increasing wages in order to cover the increasing prices, and it goes up further and further, and you get the inflation rate really getting out of control. And you see that in a lot of countries where their economy is very, very weak, and inflation is really taken over. And in this country, we certainly had that during the 1970s and 80s, and a lot of people won't remember that, and they won't remember the effects of that. So inflation is something that you need to be very cautious about. Of course, if you've got it in property and the property is rising, that will certainly increase the value of your assets. So it can be a very good thing, and certainly for me, it worked extremely well during the 70s and the 80s. At the time of the next financial crash, you will find that borrowing will become tighter. I remember in 2008 trying to finance a property, and I would be phoned by my broker, and he would say that we've got this deal. We would then go for that deal, and by the time he had actually come off the phone from me, gone back on the phone to the provider of the loan, the deal had been pulled, should I say. So it becomes a very fast-moving market where the availability of credit becomes less and less, and that exacerbates the crash in house prices, because a lot of people can't, the criteria becomes stricter and they no longer qualify where they would have qualified before when lending was loose. And that's what really drives down because then the properties on the market can't start achieving the prices that they were expecting, and valuers by this time, in other words surveyors, start revaluing properties. It's sort of like being much more cautious. The availability of credit is squeezed. Those that previously could have got on the housing ladder can't get on the housing ladder, and of course that then has an effect all the way up the housing ladder depending on which run somebody is on, and therefore people then in time have to become more realistic about what they can achieve for their house. And in fact, what usually happens is that takes some period of time. Sometimes it can take up to 2 years because people still have this expectation that the house was worth a certain value and they're not achieving it, and they will either take it off the market or they will have to move the price downwards to reflect the new current climate. Now it's interesting, I was watching a YouTube video just last night, in fact, and this is a well-known, respected financial broker, mortgage broker, and he was saying that it's simple, supply and demand, will always need houses, and that part is absolutely true, but the problem was he associated the fact that the market would move up and down a little bit, but that we were not going to, in other words, he couldn't really see the crash because we would always need houses, and that's very true. But if you think about it, if you go back to the early 2000s, we talked about we needed 200,000 new homes a year. The financial crash happened. Housing development stopped, not completely stopped, but very, very much curtailed because of the lack of demand. The lack of demand was to do with the lack of credit. It was not to do with the lack of people desiring to be able to move or to get into new housing or to get into housing for the first time. So it's important to understand what the real driver is in terms of the housing market. The tighter borrowing market, the fact that values will fall, will then make it increasingly difficult for properties that are highly leveraged. Now, prior to the last financial crisis in 2008, if you go back to the earlier part of 2000s, there was lots of gurus out there teaching people to get into buy-to-let properties, and they were talking about different strategies of how you could do that. And one of the favorite strategies that they employed, which became then illegal, that you couldn't do it, was that you were able to buy a property on a bridging finance today, and then tomorrow have it revalued, and then take out a mortgage based on the revaluation. So let's assume that you had a property that you bought for 100,000, and then tomorrow you were able to get it to revalue at 140,000 because the market was rising so fast, and because you had done a particularly good deal on that property. Then that new valuation would be the basis for your lending. So you bought it on bridging finance, so therefore you didn't have any mortgage finance. You then were able to then mortgage it at that new higher value, and often in cases you were then able to pull that value, some of that value out. You would leave some in as a deposit. At that time they were only asking for about 15% deposit, so you would in that scenario be £40,000 of equity created. Well, it's kind of false equity, but it was created there, and you'd be able to take the cash out of the proportion that didn't require you to leave it in. In other words, the equity amount that you were required to be left in at that 15%, and then you take that cash out, you use that cash, and then you would go on to do your property. Now, there was a couple of people that famously had hundreds of houses. They were able to use this process, and in fact what happened was that when the financial crisis happened, they had lots of houses, they said hundreds of houses, but none of them had any real value, because the banks then revalued these properties and said, well, actually that's not a £140,000 property, that's an £80,000 property, and now you've got no equity in it, so we need you to put the equity into that in order to sustain the loan at the current valuation. And of course they didn't have any cash because it was created with fake cash, and now they were in a very difficult position. Not only that, the banks changed the criteria, and they said we don't need 15%, we now need 25%, and so therefore you can see why they would get into huge financial difficulty. And they lost all their properties, and they are out of the property business because they never really were in it. They never actually had any assets. So the amount of leverage that you have on a property is critically important, particularly as you move towards that period where the property market is likely to take a downturn. So towards the end of the cycle, you need to be very cautious about the amount of leverage that you have in your property. So the flip side to highly leveraged properties where people have got into financial difficulty, or because the banks have squeezed them for a larger deposit in their existing housing stock, is that there will be greater opportunity out there for you to acquire properties at a very good price. And of course, the sentiment in the market then will be that that people won't know how far the property market is going to drop, and they will be very scared to get involved. So there'll be actually less people looking for those properties. There'll be less people able to afford those properties because either they don't meet the criteria, or because they don't actually have the funds. And so there will be a greater opportunity then to buy properties, and that will exist within the commercial or the residential market. And so you will be able to do deals. Incidentally, land will actually move down even further, so there will be great land opportunities. And I remember after the last financial crisis, looking at some land that would have been capable of taking 100 houses, came up at auction, and nobody was actually interested in buying that piece of land. How do you prepare yourself for the next financial and housing crisis? Well, the time to prepare for that is now. You need to understand that cash will be king. So people who are telling you to over leverage now have really, I think, got it wrong. What you want to be doing is creating chunks of cash so that you are able to take advantage of those opportunities that will be far greater, and the opportunity to make money will be far greater at the time of a financial crash than it will be during the current climate. And yet you'll hear very, very few people speaking about that, because they'll be telling you now is the time to accumulate as many properties as you can. And that's fine as long as you're accumulating real assets. In other words, if those assets you're acquiring, you've got substantial equity in them, then you're able to then use that equity later on when you need it. But if you are what you're doing is you're just creating numbers of houses. Now, I find it interesting when you go around networking events, particularly property networking events, and the question that people ask is, oh, how many properties have you got? How many properties have you got? As if that was the acid test of how well that you're doing. What I really want to know is, what is your asset value? What is the assets, and are they low leverage there? Now, that goes against the grain of what most people teach. I assure you that is the case. But if you follow this process, then you are going to be in a much stronger position when the next housing and financial crash happens, and you will then be able to pick off those properties from people who followed, which will be the mainstream, which followed the other advice and accumulated a lot of properties, and now finding that they're under a lot of stress and strain because the banks are insisting on higher deposits of their existing property. And where do they go for that money? Because everything they've got is tied up in the properties. They don't actually have cash lying around. So building up and paying down the asset value, in other words, the loan value on that, is a very good strategy, but it's also creating chunks of cash. And so in the next two segments, I'm going to talk about how you create those chunks of cash. So the first way that you create the chunks of cash, and I've alluded to this already, is actually lower your leverage percentage, particularly as you get to 2024, 2026. That period, that's when you want to be very cautious on the amount of leverage. So if you're leveraging at the percentage of 75% loan to a value, then you maybe want to be pulling that back to maybe near the 50% leverage, so that even with a price drop of 20%, you're still going to be well covered. So that will protect your existing assets. But in addition to that, you want to be therefore creating also additional cash as well. Now, part of the reason you want to create that additional cash is because you are then going to be able to use that to buy further properties, but at a low leveraged amount. But you also do want to be not putting everything in there. You want to have those pots of cash so that you can weather the storm and get through the financial crash. And then you are then able to continue to expand your business, and you'll find that there's great opportunities, not only with property, but more particularly with land. And of course, that's the area that I tend to favor. How do you increase those chunks of cash? The simple answer is through development. Now, there's two types of development. There's land development. In other words, you take a piece of land that's got no planning in place and you increase the value of that land. And so therefore there's a profit center in there. And then there's the physical development, and that's what the structure that you actually put on that piece of land, and there's a profit center there within development. Now, a lot of people don't understand that there are two profit centers within property development. There's the land development properties, the land development profit, and then there is the build profit center. So let me just briefly talk about that. The property development, in other words, putting the physical structure on, you should be able to achieve 25% of gross development value. In other words, the end value of that development. So whether that's a single house or 10 houses or however many houses it is, what's the total value that that will sell for? So think of that as like the retail price of that development. So if you were to buy a house on the market, let's say it's 400,000, then that's the value of that house, the gross development value. You're looking to make 25% on that build, so you'd be looking to make 100,000 in that scenario. Then you go back, well, that piece of property is sitting on a piece of land, so there's a land development profit to be made as well. And the way that is done is acquiring acquiring land, which is generally off the market, and you are gaining planning on it, which then gives it an increased value. And you need to be paid for that. Now, a lot of amateur and property developers or self-builders, they tend to look at property that is on the market, and that process has already happened. In other words, somebody else has captured that value. Now, there's a misconception that it's always the person who owns the land that captured that value. In fact, what you're doing is you're identifying with the landowner that they have a proposition that where there could be an increased value if you gain planning on it, and so therefore you do that. You take that process and you process it, and you make your land development value. After all, if you think about every piece of land that you've seen on the market, it's on the market at the retail price for that piece of land. Somebody has acquired it at the wholesale price, and so therefore you need to learn how to acquire the property at the wholesale price. And if you're interested in doing that, we do have a course called Find It, where we take you through the whole process of finding land to the point of where you then are ready to do development. And of course then there's another course where you take it from development and you complete the build and sell it on. So you had the opportunity then to achieve those two profit centers. I hope you found this video useful. Remember, it's part of a 9-video series that I'm running. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, and you'll be notified of when the next video in this series is being released. If you want to get started on that journey of creating chunks of money, then we have a land finding course which will help you do that. We also run a free training, so you'll find a link in the description below how you can join that free training and learn how to make substantial wealth so that you can live the life of your dreams and have a life of choice. If you've liked the video, please give us a like and share. Until the next time and the next video, I wish you a safe week or several weeks, and whatever it may be between watching videos, and I will speak to you then. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos. Then click to watch the next video. Please remember to visit our website at builditandprosper.com to get our app, or click on the button on the YouTube header if you're on desktop.